announcements, even though I didn't warn them ahead of time. And then Mark Carnesale will introduce Michael, who's our keynote speaker tonight. And so I'm really glad you're here, Michael. It's the third time I've heard you talk at LAMS. It's been different every time. And you've had a huge influence on the field of mycology. So I really appreciate your Zooming in with us. The last 2 times you were in person, and appreciated that too. But let's go ahead and by staying in the meeting, we're consenting. Got it. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I think that brings us to the main meeting. And I'll just go ahead and start and say, welcome to the new fall season. We're still virtual through the end of this year, but we have a pretty good idea that we'll be meeting in person in January of 2022. So the venue isn't set yet. There's a chance that it will be the Arboretum, but we'll wait till that ink is dried and or the council has made its final decision before we announce that. But you can expect to start meeting in person in January 2022. And following month is February, which is our mushroom fair. So we'll be back to in person for the mushroom fair. That venue has been booked already and Vanessa's already planning that. And in fact, I did see Vanessa was on. Vanessa, do you need to say anything about the mushroom fair at this time?
I don't have any super important announcements right now, but if you are a vendor who sells mushroom related goods and you want to be a vendor at the fair, just contact me and I'll get in touch with you.
Okay, great. And I want to introduce 2 new council members. If they're on, the first one would be Bat Varde. Bat, are you here tonight? And Bat, last time Bat zoomed in, her connection didn't have the bandwidth for photo. But are you here tonight, Bat? Well, I'll just introduce Bat and say that we have a new field chair, which is Bat Varde. She's already led the first field trip, which was Chicken of the Woods, Latiparus field trip, because they do have a very particular season here in SoCal. She was careful to warn everyone about that some people are allergic, and I happen to be one of them, and I did not go on her field trip. But I'm glad to see we're back having field trips again. And I'd just like to welcome Bat, even though we don't see her right now. And so thank you, Bat, for joining. We really appreciate your contribution. And the other person is Aaron Thompson. And Aaron has joined as the secretary. Hi, Aaron, nice to see you. And, as I mentioned last year, the secretary is an extremely important position, and Aaron will be filling that for this year. And Aaron, I would just turn it over to you if you want to say anything about your reading group.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so I've been doing a reading group the past few months called Reading the Mycoverse. You probably have seen the emails. It's been almost regularly every other Monday. We read Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life. That was our first book, which was really good. And now we are reading The Mushroom at the End of the World, which is a book about the Matsutake mushroom. And yeah, so our next meeting is next Monday. We meet outside in parks. We have a new location. I'll send out an email about that this week. And yeah, come join us. And if you haven't read the book, you can just come and join and listen in. We've had a lot of folks who's come in who are new, who are just interested. So yeah, it's great.
Okay, that sounds really great. I'm glad you've been able to kick that off and make that successful. And thanks for joining the LAMS Council. And I'd like to thank all of the other council members who are returning this year, who've been serving for so many years. But there's one in particular I want to thank, and that's Mark Carnesale. Mark is stepping down at the end of the year from being the vice president and program chair. And if you're like me, you think Mark has done an amazing job. I think I joined LAMS in 2011, and he's never missed a program date without a wonderful speaker. Tonight is one of the best, and it's just emblematic of the job that Mark's done for all these years. And so I think we owe Mark a round of thanks for all of that service. And he's going to be really hard to find someone to replace him too. But just thanks again, Mark, for all of those wonderful speakers.
You're welcome.
And are there any other announcements for tonight? Well, if there are no other announcements, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Mark, and Mark will introduce tonight's speaker. So thank you, Mark.
Can everybody hear me now? Am I on?
You are on.
I don't know how this works. I'm very shy and I usually don't speak to the club, as David knows. But this is a very special speaker to me. I would say about 11 years ago, I went to Telluride, and at the time there was only about 15 or 20 people that showed up for the meetings at our Monday meetings. And even in my mid 50s, other than Andre, I was the youngest person there. So when I said I was going to Telluride, people just sort of laughed and said it was a magic mushroom festival. And I went, and I really had one of the greatest experiences of my mushrooming life. But one of the great highlights of that experience was I went to see the talk by Dr. Michael Bugh. Most people know him as Mike. And what was amazing is he spoke for about an hour about psilocybin, but the question and answers went on for 45 minutes until they finally cut him off. It was one of the most fascinating talks I'd ever seen. And about a year later, I became program chairman of the club. And I was told at the time, because this is the way many clubs were run, that I could not have someone speak about psilocybin. I knew right away that I was going to change that rule as soon as possible. And I knew the person to do that was Dr. Michael Bugh, because he's such a solid person to speak about something like that. He's not a hippie, he's not anything like that. He is a real, microbiologist. And I just want to say he came to our Happy Times, spent time here, and I really believe his brain will be in the Smithsonian someday. But he is really one of the kindest, most humble guests we have ever had. And we just so miss him that he can't travel anymore, because we really appreciate his company. And he's the only person that ever showed up with a case of wine. So he will always be on my list as one of my favorite speakers ever. So please enjoy Dr. Michael Bugh.
Okay. It's going to take a few moments to load. I have a very slow internet. And let me know when you see a slide saying identifying the unusual mushrooms of Cascadia.
We can see it now.
Okay, great. From here on in, the slide should pretty much keep up with me. Sometimes there's a 3 or 4 second delay. I live 2 miles up a 1-lane gravel road at the end of the DSL line, so my service is very slow. And I want to talk about the new book that I just written, Mushrooms of Cascadia, an Illustrated Key. but it really is designed as a book that'll teach people how to identify mushrooms anywhere they are in North America. And I think it'll be especially useful in Southern California. I spent a number of years there, both as a student at Harvey Mudd College and as a professor at Harvey Mudd College. And we've got a lot more mushrooms up north, but we've got a lot of the same mushrooms that you have down your way. And one thing I had never intended to do is write a field guide to mushrooms. And this all is really the fault of Dr. Joe Ammirati, who in about 2008 asked me whether or not there were any Cortinarius mushrooms growing under the oaks. And my house is built right into the edge of an oak grove. And I said, well, I'd never seen any, but I would go out and take a look. And these 4 photographs are some of those Cortinarius that I found in the first 2 weeks I was looking at Cortinarius under the oaks. And I continued that study till today. And at this point, I've found over 50, probably close to 100 different species of Cortinarius. We haven't worked it all out yet. Only 2 of them ever had a name. And then in 2019, I started to write just some stories about mushroom hunting in the gorge. And again, Dr. Ammirati contacted me, said, oh, it's fabulous. You're writing a field guide to the mushrooms of the Columbia River Gorge. Well, I wasn't, but suddenly I was. And so this is the front and back cover of my new book. It's got roughly 1,050 color photographs. Over 900 of them are my own photographs. It covers over 950 species. Technically, the range is from coastal Alaska to central California, reaches inland to Idaho. But I really emphasize in this book how you identify mushrooms, much more than what individual mushrooms are. And the most important part of the book, I've got a 15-page introduction with a few recipes and how to hunt safely and everything. But it's a key to the fungi of Cascadia, but it's really a key to how you identify all fungi. And it starts on page 17 of the book. And the first part of the key is sort of a very general thing. So under the first choice, and in the key, it's generally dichotomous. You have a choice between A and B, but I often give multiple choices because it's more efficient. So first I separated out the gilled mushrooms because most of what we pick and are going to be trying to identify is going to be a gilled mushroom. So right away I pull those off the top. So if you've got a gilled mushroom, and I give some examples here, there's 4 different examples. You go to page 139, start with key lead 175A, and you start to evaluate your gilled mushrooms. If you've got something that looks like an unbranched, fleshy to woody club, you go to page 135. If it looks like if it's a jelly fungus, you go to 129. If it's got teeth or spines, whether it's soft or woody, you go to page 119. If it's a coral mushroom, and so on. And then we go on with the bird's nest fungi, the puffballs, the truffles and the desert stalk truffles, the polypores, assorted ascomycetes, and then the boletes, and finally the chanterelles. So that's the introductory part of the key. And so from chanterelles, you go straight to the first key lead, because that's at 3E, and chanterelles would be key lead 4A. So the way I laid out the book is I tried to put all the chanterelles, or things that look like chanterelles, close together so that people could compare them one to another and see how you tell them apart. For example, recently I had an email from Steve Trudell, who's written Mushrooms of the Pacific Northwest. And he was asking me, well, how do you tell Canthorellus cascadensis from Canthorellus formosus? And my idea in creating this book is by putting the similar things close together, you can get that comparison right away. But I focus on how you tell one mushroom from another. So the Canthorellus formosa group, and there's 4 different species of these yellow chanterelles. You've got one I don't talk about in the book called the the mud puppy, I guess is the California name for a great yellow type chanterelle. But cascadensis has basically white, oops, I need to back up, sorry. Has white on the underside, and the top starts out white, and it's very closely related to the white chanterelle, Cantharellus subalbinus, but then it develops very, very bright colors on the cap, but the gills, not the gills, but these blunt forking ridges underneath stay this more or less white color. And Roseocanis is distinguished by having much more colorful things. And then these are things on the facing page that look a lot like chanterelles that may or may not be related to chanterelles. And so now let's get into some of the things that are in the book itself. A lot of these quartz that are associated with oaks turned out to be quite common in California when we started to name them, and are found clear up into British Columbia. And one of the most spectacular quartz that are in the book and that we've recently named is Cortinarius valingae. It's named for Elsie Valinga, who's a Dutch mycologist who's working at UC Berkeley and has been there for years. Wonderful mycologist. This mushroom can be as big around as a dinner plate. Beautiful, spectacular mushroom. And I couldn't believe that I had the honor of getting to name it. Something this spectacular, this big, it had to have been named, and yet it wasn't. And then a week later, the first thing I did when Joe Amorati contacted me, and it happened to be early November, is I went out in the oak woods within walking distance of my house, and I found 5 different species of Cortinarias. And I photographed them and took the spore measurements, did some chemistry, sent the information to Joe, and he said, "You have 5 new species." The next week, I was out at Syncline Winery. I'm a wine lover. The owner of Syncline, James Mantone, loves mushrooms and wine. He says, "Hey, I've got these beautiful quartz in the oaks behind the winery. I was sure they're going to be in the book, but they aren't." And I went out there, I found 6 different species. All 6 were new, all 6 were unnamed. Can you imagine a mushroom? This mushroom is as big as a luncheon plate, not as big as a dinner plate, but it's a big, beautiful violet and white mushroom. It gets named Albolitocinus because it's both white and lilac. And so I use entirely scientific names, by the way, because if I use a scientific name anywhere in the world, if someone's reading my book or reading my publications, they will know exactly what I'm talking about because everyone's going to use the same Latin name, where the common names vary. And sometimes even within the United States, we'll have 5 or 10 different common names for just one species. So I got really excited. And then this thing, the photography doesn't do it justice, but it was just a flaming bright yellow-orange with these orangey dots. Again, totally unknown, but a spectacular mushroom the size of a coffee cup saucer. And how can all these things be out there and not known? And here's some of the mycelium that the mushroom is growing from. I try and catch as much detail in my photographs as I can. And then I was hiking about 8 miles from my house up the Rattlesnake Canyon, and a friend of mine said, "Hey, there's a whole bunch of Russulazarum polina over here." And I walked over, and this is what he was looking at. I had never seen anything like this mushroom, this blue thing. It's kind of yellow underneath, yellow-orange stem. This clump was about 2.5 feet in diameter. Here's the same clump 3 weeks or so later. You can see my hand for reference up in the thing. And here is a mushroom that's it turns out to be a very close relative of the late oyster mushroom, Pinellus serotinus. There's only 3 total species in the genus Sarcomixa, and the 3rd one grows in China. It's Sarcomixa edulis. It's a delicious edible. Pinellus serotinus, now Saromixa serotina, is a decent edible, but there's no way to tell whether this is edible or not. But I can tell you that David Aurora got so excited that he jumped in the car and drove all the way up to my house from California so he could go out and see this thing in person. And then I told Paul Stamets about how well this mushroom held up. Nothing seemed to eat it. Nothing seemed to attack it. It didn't get moldy. It stayed fresh and prime for a long time. So I took a piece of the mushroom culture, mailed it off to Paul. He cultivated it, sent me a block, a mushroom growing block. I grew it out, and this is what I got, this Sarcomixa. The interesting question is it edible or not? Nobody would know because it's a brand new species. But since it is closely related to two known edibles, I said, I'm going to eat some. And I started with a little baby primordia, even smaller and younger than this. And it was one of the most delicious mushrooms that I've ever cooked. It didn't get all flaccid and soft like a lot of mushrooms. It wasn't too hard. It wasn't too soft. It browned beautiful. It was just perfect. And so when they got full size, like these in the middle, I took one of these and cooked it up. But then I got this strange sort of numb sensation in my mouth and throat. And I decided, well, I'm not going to eat any more of this one. But it's gone extinct in the wild, so it's never going to get named. But I wanted to point out that when you go out looking, you can find some really spectacular things that nobody's ever noticed. Every single time I've been out this summer, and I've only had time to go out for like 5 or 6 afternoons, the whole summer and fall, this is through today, every time I have found a mushroom I've never seen before, and about half of the time I've found a new species, because I'm just looking at things that are different. So here's this Panella serotinus, the late oyster mushroom in itself. The little inset shows what it looks like from the top. But I'm really interested in this main photograph because look at the details. Photographed January 3rd, 2010. It was 10 degrees Fahrenheit. There was 3 feet of snow on the ground. It had been below 15 Fahrenheit for a week. These mushrooms were not frozen. They were warm. They were fresh. I was just astounded. And I have since found when all the waterfalls in the Columbia Gorge were frozen and had been really, really cold for a long time, I saw a bunch of Boletus edulis growing under spruce trees at the mouth of the gorge down near Portland. And the big ones were all frozen solid, but there were some button mushrooms. Now these buttons of edulis were so big that I could barely get my 2 hands to touch each other around the stake. But the babies were not frozen. They were delicious. I ate them. And even in that freezing weather, the metabolic heat of the mushroom, I found just absolutely fascinating. So, and then I got to looking at some of the polypores under the oaks. In this Pseudo-Inonotus dryadius, the main thing in the photograph up here, that was 3 feet in diameter. Now here's our free spore print underneath. So it's a white spored mushroom. And amazingly, this is an annual. It grows 1 year and dies. Growing on a smaller oak tree, it's smaller. And then this thing was growing outside my house. And I thought I had another Pseudo-Inonotus dryadius, but it had a brown spore print. Even though the sponge, on the underside, the polypores look about the same. The brown bruising is about the same. The cut interior looks about the same, and yet it's a totally different mushroom. And indeed, I just have the brand new polypores of Eastern and Central and Southern North America that I'm about to review by the Bassett's. This thing isn't in it, nothing like it. And nothing like it has ever been reported from the Northwest or California. So I have yet another mystery to solve. And from where I'm sitting right now, this particular mushroom is about 25 feet from me and straight in the direction I'm looking as I'm talking to you all. So there's these constant surprises out there that fascinate me. Now, this is something that I thought was just a different color morph of the Pseudo-Inonotus. It has the white spore print, but when I finally took a saw with me and sawed one of these in half, I could see that it was not an annual, it's a perennial mushroom. But under the microscope, the spores were the same size, the same shape, the same color. But it was only when I sent this thing off for DNA that I was able to get an identification on it. And it turned out to be a thing called Fomidoporia fissurata. And I find it all over the place here. And yet it had never before been recorded from anywhere in Cascadia. I think it's probably reasonably common in California, but we'd never found it in our area. And it's associated, you can see the acorns here. This is with our Oregon white oak. It's an oak associate. It's an interesting thing to find, but it's an annual and decent sized mushroom. Now, also under the oaks, there's some really beautiful things like this Oreoboletus flavoporus. The thing is kind of soft, kind of slimy, not of interest to eat. But I really get fascinated by the beautiful mushrooms, and just the color of the sponge on this thing is so neat. Took me a while to identify it because, again, it wasn't in any of my books of mushrooms of the Pacific Northwest because it's an oak associate, and oaks are rare in Cascadia. They get more common as you get down into southern Oregon, and then very common in California. But in Washington and British Columbia and Idaho, oak ecosystem is rare. Now here is something that I did not think we had at all in the Pacific Northwest until recently. And this is a photograph from my own land that I took about a year ago, the butter boletes, Butyriboletus quercy regius. And I happened to submit a sample of this to David Aurora just as they were naming this thing. So this is a California mushroom. Yet in the Columbia River Gorge where I live, we have a refugia of California species. And so when I write a book about the Columbia River Gorge mushrooms, which is really what my book is about, rather than mushrooms of all of Cascadia, it covers a lot of California species. Now, the diameter of this mushroom was about 50% greater than the diameter of a dinner plate. The mushroom in the inset is exactly the same specimen, just picked and laid on its side. So you can see that it's a mushroom that bruises blue, but the flesh is butter colored. And it's not as tasty as a king bolete, but this is a darn delicious mushroom. And just all you need to do is find one and you've got a meal for your whole family. Butyriboletus quercy regius, very distinctive mushroom. I don't normally eat blue bruising mushrooms, but this is one that's great. So here's the edulus complex. And we were talking earlier about Boletus barosii, and we notice a little bit darker sponge when it's fairly young than you find in the edulus, but these are all close relatives of Boletus edulus itself. And Boletus edulus is characterized by a netted stem, white sponge, a kid-skin smooth cap. Barosii tends to grow more with pines, and when we were talking earlier, those mushrooms that were in the photograph were associated with pines. Fibrillosis is fairly rare, not as tasty. Boletus mottii is very rare, but you can see the beautiful netting, the white sponge that's characteristic of the edulus complex. And this is the queen bolete, Boletus virginius. I can barely tell the difference in flavor between an edulus and a virginius, but the neat thing about it is the edulus are, where I live, are just coming to the end of their fruiting season. They'll be fruiting on the Oregon coast for another few weeks yet, but the virginius is just starting. And this photograph is shown under pines, but virginius will grow under conifers, under things like Douglas fir and grand fir, as well as pines, and will even show up under oaks. And so here's how I would handle the chanterelles all together. Here you can see the very, very bright gills of Rosea canis versus the light colored gills, but the bright cap of Cantharellus cascadensis versus the more or less all white Cantharellus subalbidus, but it bruises orange, and then the Cantharellus formosus group. So the thing I try and focus in the book that I wrote was how is putting these things together so people can tell them apart readily. And these, I've got two different blue chanterelles. Now, until just a few years ago, we only had one name for all Polyozellus species, and that was Polyozellus multiplex. But then a friend of mine in Newfoundland was looking at the Polyozellus of Newfoundland, and she thought she was looking at least two different species. And so I got involved, Steve Trudell got involved, and some Eastern Europeans got involved. And we took a close look at Polyozellus, and we found that in the Northwest, and indeed in the entire West Coast, we don't have any Polyozellus multiplex at all. We have, at least in Cascadia, 3 species. In fact, I don't know how many of these reach into California, but you wouldn't have any but these 3. Is Polyozellus azulinus is one of the 2. Polyozellus Mary Margaretae, which is one I had the pleasure of naming myself after Mary Margaret, and just this really, really beautiful lady. And it's a really beautiful mushroom that is not so tasty, but is wonderful for dyeing fabrics. Now, Gomphus clefaides, when I started, was considered a chanterelle. It's not at all related to the chanterelles. It's actually closely related to coral fungi. But you can see the same kind of blunt ridges on the underside. It's a beautiful lavender color on the underside when it's young. On the top, it's supposed to be a choice edible, but it's always very, very wormy, so I've never eaten it. I was really looking forward to eating Craterellus cornucopioides, which is a black mushroom and only grows under oak. And so when I found this thing here, I was certain that I had a new species. Indeed, Noah Siegel was certain that I had a new species. But when we did the DNA, it's exactly like the black trumpets, which only grow under oaks. And yet there were no oaks anywhere near where this was growing. And so last night I cooked up a batch of purchased dried Craterellus cornucopioides, because I had heard this is one of the most delicious mushrooms with the truffle-like flavor. But whoever dried the collection I had didn't do a good job. We wound up throwing out the whole batch, but fortunately I did not mix it into the quiche. I got into my freezer and got some frozen duxelles made out of king boletes, and we quickly substituted for the Craterellus. But normally a very good distinctive edible. However, my experience was not so good last night. And the Ammonitis. So as we were talking about in the pre-game operation here, you really need to know the Ammonitis if you're going to eat any. Amanita calyptroderma is edible, not particularly incredible, but a decent edible. And it has very distinctive striations along the edge of the cap that usually aren't present in Amanita phalloides. But I've seen in California Amanita calyptroderma where the striations were not well developed. And I've seen Amanita phalloides where the striations were slightly developed. And when they were growing side by side, I had a heck of a time telling them apart. In fact, when I give my talk about should I have eaten that, I show a photograph of Amanita calyptroderma next to a photograph of Amanita phalloides, where you can't tell which is which. You absolutely can't figure it out. Now, in this case, I picked one that's really distinctive, but calyptroderma isn't always that distinctive. So the mushroom is fully enclosed in a universal veil when it's young. In fact, it looks much like a puffball. And that's why I tell people, if you're going to eat puffballs, slice them open from top to bottom, through the middle, take a look at the half. And if you see something like this inside, that ain't no puffball. Puffballs are always uniform, pure white. They're soft like a marshmallow. They're not sticky like a marshmallow, but they look like a marshmallow inside uniformly. And that's an edible puffball. You see something like this inside, you've got a baby Amanita. Now, the most delicious mushroom in the photograph is this one down here, Amanita ocreata. And I think the guy who told me about how delicious it was from Southern California, as I recall. And he related the story to me about the best meal he'd ever had in his life, which only lasted about 4 or 5 more days, because this thing is deadly poisonous. It has amatoxins in it. So you really need to know how to identify Amanita ocreata and Amanita phalloides if you're going to fool around with Amanitas, but also be aware that they're fairly variable. In fact, when I found this Amanita obconicobasis, This is a mushroom I found once in the Columbia Gorge. It's also been found once in Southern California, and those are the only two places it's known for. I thought I might have found a young Amanita ocreata. It turns out to be a completely different species once we've done the DNA. But here we can see some striations on the edge of the cap, like you would see in an edible Amanita. But sometimes I see things that look like striations on Amanita ocreata. I'm not one of the people that eats any Amanita. And one of the popular Amanitas that people eat is the ones that don't have a ring on the stem. They have a very sac-like vulva, but it usually breaks, leaving all of the vulva in the ground. Sometimes there's a little bit of vulva on the top. This is the Amanita vaginata group. It's a very complex group, very difficult to identify one species from another. They're all considered edible, but I have dealt with poisoning cases where somebody had found an Amanita phalloides where the ring had gotten rubbed off, and they ate Amanita phalloides thinking they were eating a grisette, member of the Amanita vaginata group. These are edible, they're not incredible. I'd leave them alone. That's my strong recommendation. And now we're going to talk about what you would normally call Amanita muscaria, but it turns out that throughout North America, the main Amanita that we have is Amanita chrysoblema. And it was named in 1918 from Michigan, but when you do the DNA, this is the Amanita we have in Washington State. We have it on the East Coast. We have it in Canada. Now, down in California, you mostly have a mushroom that looks just like this, and it is Amanita muscaria variety flavivulvata, but it's an absolute lookalike. You can't tell them apart without the DNA. So what about the cap color? Amanita chrysoblema and Amanita muscaria in all of its varieties can be pure white, it can be yellow, it can be orange, it can be red. All of those colors. In fact, it can even be dark brown. But the typical things that tell me it's in the muscaria group is this vulva. It usually leaves 3 or 4 rings of tissue around the base of the stem. And this is Amanita aprica. It's a spring member of the muscaria group. And it has the warts don't rub off as easily as they rub off on Amanita chrysoblema and Amanita muscaria variety flavivulvata. But for a long time, we did not know whether Amanita aprica and Amanita albanicola were toxic or not. I suspected they were. They look too much like Amanita muscaria for me to try them. But some people from the Oregon Mycological Society did accidentally try Amanita aprica, and we now know that it is fully as toxic as an Amanita muscaria. The same is true of Amanita albanicola, courtesy of some people from Idaho who ate a bunch of these. So these all contain ibotenic acid and mucimol. They cause perspiration, salivation, but they also cause visions. They change your size perception, change your time perception, but you often fall into a deep comatose sleep in which you dream that somebody's trying to throw you off a cliff and you're breaking up all the furniture in the house or something like that. So it's a mushroom you do not want to eat, although this is a legal hallucinogen. Psilocybe mushrooms are highly illegal and are relatively safe. This is totally legal, extremely dangerous. And Amanita panthrenoides has exactly the same toxins, ibotenic acid and mucimol. Amanita gemata is a pure yellow lookalike, but I find color variants all the way from pure yellow to dark brown. And so this gemata complex seems to integrate with the panthrenoides. And years ago, when I was looking at the chemistry, now this differs from muscaria, by the way, in having a single roll collar at the base rather than a multiple set of rolls. The darker the cap color, the higher the toxin levels in the mushroom. So in Amanita panthrenoides, which is a mushroom we've known all along as Amanita pantherina, a European species, is a very nasty mushroom, even worse than Amanita muscaria were you to ingest it. And another Amanita that's important to know with a totally different toxin is Amanita smithiana. That's this mushroom on the left. And is often mistaken for Tricholoma marilianum, the white matsutake. Now you might know of our Western matsutake by Tricholoma magnivelare. It turns out that's only on the East Coast. And our West Coast species was actually named by Murrell in the early 1800s. And so we've known about this species for a long time. It's a name that was long lost. So how are we going to safely tell this nasty Amanita smithiana? And if you eat the smithiana in a day or two, your kidneys are going to shut down and you're going to wind up in the hospital with kidney dialysis, and you'll be in the hospital for a few weeks to a few months. You won't die, but you don't want to have that experience. Now, they both wind up at a point, but the Tricholoma marilianum and the East Coast mushroom taper slowly from the top to the base. They don't have a bulbous middle like the Amanita smithiana. And if you lay the stem in the palm of your hand and press down with your thumb and press down hard, nothing will happen. And that's also true with this Amanita smithiana. You press down hard, nothing will happen. But if you press down with all your might, this Amanita smithiana is going to shatter. The Tricholoma marilianum will not shatter unless it's wormy. But the really neat thing about it is if you cut the stem off from the cap, and the stem is a little bit tough to eat, and when you cut that off with a knife, the knife will squeak, a very loud and distinctive squeak. It won't squeak if you cut an Amanita smithiana. So you can, there's two reliable tricks for telling Tricholoma marilianum from Amanita smithiana. And marilianum is highly prized in Japan. If this partial veil was complete and no gills were showing, it would look sufficiently phallic to please the Japanese, and that's why they prize this mushroom as much as the flavor. And it would be $100 per mushroom in Japan, a very highly prized mushroom. It's an acquired taste. Sometimes I eat it and love it. Often I eat it and loathe it. It has an odor that David Roy has described as a cross between cinnamon red hots and dirty gym socks. And sometimes it tastes more like dirty gym socks to me than anything else, but sometimes it just tastes absolutely divine. And now moving on to some of the medicinal mushroom, Trametes versicolor, turkey tails, I think is the most interesting of all of the medicinal mushrooms. And I get flooded with people sending me pictures saying, oh, I found turkey tails. Well, I want people to get a good understanding of what a turkey tail looks like. Highly variable from the top. They're always thin. They're always pliable. They're always leathery. And when you take a look at the underside, it's filled with little, small, round pores. And that's a turkey tail. So these are all turkey tails. Now, if you turn it over and the underside is smooth, you can't see any small pores at all, but the top looks like a turkey tail, but the underside is smooth, you've got a Sterium species. There's a lot of different Sterium species. It's very complicated. These are not good to eat. I don't think they'll hurt you, but they're not turkey tails. And this thing over here, again, it's got gray pores on the underside instead of white ones. And the pores are slightly ragged. They're not at all round. And Trimetopsis cervina, which is a mushroom we knew grew in the Pacific Northwest, but nobody had ever found and photographed. I found it just as I was finishing up the book, again, within walking distance of my house. Looks kind of like a turkey tail from the top, but you turn it over on the underside and you have these very distinctive ragged pores that look more teeth-like than pore-like. And another thing that looks like a turkey tail from the top, Trichaptum abiatinum. Again, the teeth are a little bit ragged. They're nice, not round, but they're also this beautiful lavender color. Now, there's also some polypores that really get me excited, and this is the one that I have looked for 45 years. I have yet to find one myself. Paul Stamets was kind enough to send me a photograph of Jim Goon, a former student of mine who now works for Fungi Perfecti, with what they call the green lady. And this photograph here in the upper corner is a very, very young Brygioporus nobilissimus. This is probably one of the rarest mushrooms in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. And like I say, I've searched and searched and searched and never found one. And I was regionally in contact with Jim. He's found 2 or 3, but he's out in the woods all day long, day after day, week after week, and he occasionally does stumble on one of these. But if you look at the DNA in the leaves of the trees, you'll find the DNA of Brygioporus nobilissimus not only on the noble fir, which is where this mushroom fruits exclusively, but you find the DNA in the needles of all other conifer species, and you find the DNA in the leaves of hardwood trees. So this is an endosymbiont. It's growing on the leaves and it's growing on the needles of a wide range of plants, but it rarely fruits. And when it does choose to fruit, it's only on noble fir, and it can be giant. It can live for 100, 200 years. You can sometimes see trees growing out of the top of it. A really neat mushroom. Don't pick it if you see it, but it's just rarely fruits. So when we talk about abundance versus non-abundance, we don't really know what's out there because all we see is the fruit of the plant, of the organism. I keep calling them a plant, but mushrooms are really much more closely related to animals than they are to plants. And so now let's look at some of these polypore things. We have all of the albatrellus species, including Scudder juralicii, which was once in albatrellus, are edible. And they're a little bit tough, but I think if you cook them in a pressure cooker, which I haven't yet tried, you can soften them up and they'd be quite delicious. But I'm particularly interested in this bright blue polypore, Albatrellus fledii, up here in the corner. And when it's even younger, it's really bright blue, just in a gorgeous electric blue color. And then when it gets old, there's just a little bit of the blue left, and it's more of this ochraceous color here. Well, Albatrellus confluens is only ochraceous. It never has any blue at all. Now, if you take the DNA of Albatrellopsis fledii and compare it to the DNA of Albatrellus confluens, which is strictly a European species, according to the literature, that is, the DNA is identical. So what we have out here is a blue variant of the European Albatrellus confluens. It's long had a different name, but now as we look at the DNA, we find that they are one and the same. And I think that's really intriguing because usually our mushrooms are going to, when we do the DNA, if they look a little different from the European species, they're definitely going to be different. But it isn't always the case. And this is a beautiful example. And now there's also the woody polypores that you couldn't turn around and eat, but there's a lot of interest in them for other reasons. Fomitopsis officinalis over here, known as agaricon, is a highly prized medicinal mushroom. Now the coastal Native Americans, the North Coast, not down into California and even Southern Oregon, but in the North Coast Native Americans, they buried their dead not in the ground, but they would put them in canoes up in a tree or in canoes on an island. So they used an above ground burial, and that would trigger a lot of mushroom fruitings. And so these northern Native American tribes associated mushrooms with death, and so they didn't eat them. But medicine men were very fond of agaricon, and this Fomitopsis officinalis, and they would even carve big specimens of it and mount it on the end of their canoe as a talisman, and the medicine men used it as a talisman and used it as medicine. Fomitopsis Fomentarius amadou is a really neat woody, hard conch. It's a perennial conch. And the interesting thing about it is if you peel it open inside, it's got this soft material. And if you have a fire going at the end of the day, you can take an ember from the fire and nestle it in that soft material of Fomentarius, and then wrap it in a piece of leather, carry it with you all day, and then in the evening extract that ember and start a new fire. Yeah, so it's really valuable before we had matches. And it was also used medicinally as a medicinal mushroom. Otzi the Iceman was carrying this in his pouch when they found him. The other neat thing about it is you can take that interior material and pound it and make a very soft leather-like felt, which is then made in Eastern Europe into hats, into purses, into wallets that are just luxurious. And the photograph of me on the back cover of the book, I'm wearing a hat made out of amadou, Fomentarius. And Ganoderma oregonense is an annual polypore. The other two in the photograph are perennial, but closely related to reishi, another interesting medicinal mushroom. I just love it for its beauty. But what got me started mushrooming to begin with is I was in graduate school, a chemistry major. Somebody brought me a bag of morels, and my wife and I had just gotten married. We cooked those up. They had a texture I thought was like a steak, a flavor like a fine New York steak or a ribeye steak. I had never paid any attention to mushrooms. I've never even taken a course in biology. I was a chemist. I did a lot of physics, a lot of engineering, a lot of math, but no biology at all. These morels changed my life, and I started pursuing morels like mad. And every single morel known from the Northwest is in my book. Almost all of them also grow in California. Morchella brunea is a hardwood associate. It can reach a very good size. It's a very, very delicious, very, very meaty mushroom. Morchella populophylla is associated with cottonwoods along riverbanks. I searched and searched and searched for it over a 50-year period. I've only found it once. That was 2 years ago. I got invited to somebody's abandoned pear orchard, and there they were, the mushrooms here in this photograph, the populophylla. And it's so rare that there wasn't even any records of whether or not this is an edible or not. I said, well, it's a morel. It's got to be a good edible. So I cooked up half of the collection when I got home, and it is absolutely delicious, meaty, one of the tastiest of all morels. And very, very distinctive because morels are hollow inside. The stem does not go all the way up to the very top of the cap. In populophylla, called the half-free morel, the stem almost makes it to the top, but it's hollow. Morchella snyderi is another favorite edible, and the thing I like about it is it typically grows in clusters. I've seen clusters of this thing up to 15 inches tall with 20 mushrooms in the cluster. A few years ago, I saw a commercial mushroom picker car parked near a 5-year-old clear cut, and I was wondering, well, what is he doing there? Well, and I said, well, he usually hides his car, so he's hunting somewhere else. I called him up that night. He had picked 800 pounds of Morchella snyderi, he and a friend, in that 40-acre clear cut that day. There shouldn't have been one there. So what I learned about Morchella snyderi from that event is even after a clear cut, this mushroom will come back year after year after year. So once you find a patch of snyderi, you can rely on it. It can be very big, very rewarding, and it's very delicious. Now, Morchella eohespera, when I first found it, I thought, well, it might be Morchella brunea. So I sent it in for a sample. And at the same week I sent it in, my friend Andres Wojtek from Newfoundland sent in a sample of morels to the same DNA lab, and it turned out to be matching. Well, this is really unusual because these are what we call black morels or elaticlade morels. And the East Coast elaticlade morels, except for the landscape morel, which is spread around by humans, are all different than the West Coast morels. So here was a mushroom found both on the East Coast and on the West Coast. And when we started researching it to write up the paper, and we named some other morels in that paper as well, we decided, Andres mainly, on naming this Morchella Eos for the god of the sunrise, Hesperus for the god of the sunset, because it was growing both in the East and in the West. And indeed, when we started looking at herbarium collections from the Alps, from Scandinavia, from China, this mushroom was present in all of those collections. And it turns out to be the most common black morel worldwide, is a native morel, very, very delicious. It grows singly. And it turns out that years ago, maybe 20, 30 years ago, one person in Norway found 3 or 4 of these on a riverbank, set them in, and they named him Morchella norvegiensis. They didn't know much about the distribution. We thought our mushroom might be norvegiensis. We went to Norway, we looked for it, we didn't find it. So we went ahead and named it, but it has since been found again in Norway and turns out to be identical to our mushroom. So my lovely Eohesperus name is now a synonym of norvegiensis. And, whoa, I went too far. Let me back up. And the blonde morels are named because they're blonde. Well, it turns out that in this photograph, only one of these mushrooms is a true blonde morel. That's the esculenta clade of Morchella, and that's Morchella americana. And we have Morchella americana on the East Coast and on the West Coast, down into California. This is our most common of the esculenta clade morels. And the characteristic feature is that if you try and follow the ridges from the bottom to the top, you can't, because the mushroom is so convoluted. They don't make nice lines. But if you follow this mushroom that Maggie Rogers, and Maggie is the woman I named that Polyozellus Mary Margareta in honor of, you can pretty much follow the ridges straight up and down. And here's your common burn morel, Morchella eximia. You can follow the ridges straight up and down. Now, it turns out there are 3 different burn morels that all look identical. You can only tell them apart by DNA. Luckily, I sent this particular collection into France for DNA analysis. At the time, they were re-resurrecting the name Morchella eximia, and I realized that, yes, we have Morchella eximia, the same as in Europe, on the West Coast, and this is going to be one of your most common burn morels of California. But the burn morel that really fascinates me is this one over here, Morchella tomentosa. When it's really young, it's almost black because it's covered both in the stem and on the head with little tiny black hairs. But as the mushroom grows, you don't get additional hairs. They just sort of get diluted. So by the time it's mature, it looks a lot like, in color, like an esculenta clade. But again, you can follow the ridges from top to bottom. But it turns out this isn't even an elated clade morel. It's in its own special clade because it grows from a sclerotium in the ground. Now, when do morels grow? If I ask that question, normally people say, well, May is morel month. And my indicators for morels, at least up north, I'm looking for when the trillium flowers are starting to fade from white and getting a little bit of pink, or when the Calypso bulbosa orchids are blooming, or if I'm looking for Morchella americana, I'm looking for when the lilac trees are in full bloom. This mushroom doesn't start to fruit typically until July. It fruits and burns. It can fruit all summer long if there's enough rainfall, right up till snowfall happens. And so this is a very interesting morel where you can, in a good wet summer, in a burn, and even 3 and 4 and 5 years after a burn, you can find huge quantities of Morchella tomentosa. It's known as the gray morel. It is very thick-meated, very, very delicious. Morchella tridentina is also thick-meated, delicious, a good-sized mushroom. One day when Steve Trudell and I were going mushrooming together, he had never, ever found Morchella tridentina that Maggie is holding. I had never ever found Morchella americana. Now in the Columbia Gorge, this grows in enough quantity to be sold commercially. I see baskets of it for sale in the stores, and they come from the gorge. And yet I've only found it personally twice in one particular spot. I've occasionally found the base of the stem where somebody's beaten me to it, but this is one I can't find. And this one over here, the Tridentina, is one that Steve can't find. So we went out all day long. The only thing I found was lots and lots of Tridentina. The only thing he found was lots and lots of Americana. So, and I don't know even if to this day if Steve has ever seen this one, but it's very common, very abundant for me. Now we'll move on to the ascomycetes. Many ascomycetes are really small. Only a few, like the morels, are nice and big and meaty, but they have some fascinating habitats. And one neat thing is the alder tongues. This is an alder cone, the reproductive structure of the alder. And these tongues are actually growths caused by the fungus, but they are not mushroom material. This is all plant material. There's no mushroom fruiting body that ever forms. The spores just form naked on the surface of the mushroom. And so, and this will overwinter, it'll turn black by the next year. I learned about alder tongues with Tom Volk when we were hunting mushrooms in Newfoundland, and was eager to find them. And I finally found them just a time or two here in the Northwest. Just an interesting mushroom. You can't eat it, but a curiosity. And it's the same genus, though, that produces peach leaf curl, for example. And here's another interesting mushroom, Cudoniella clavis. This mushroom up here is the mushroom I thought I was photographing. I didn't even see these other two because the top one is about the size of my little fingernail. And then when I blew up my picture, I saw these little tooth mushrooms, which turns out to be Pisoloma coelifera. And I had already published Ascomycetes of North America, so the Pisoloma coelifera is not in the book. I hadn't even known it existed, and yet it's found right in my neighborhood. And some of these little ascos are really tiny. This is a single elk pellet, you know, about maybe a quarter of an inch long, quarter of an inch in diameter. And this is just part of the surface of the elk pellet. When we took it into the lab and started looking at it under a dissecting microscope, there were 5 different species of the mushroom, 1 basidiomycete, a little tiny coprinus, and 4 different ascos. And 2 of them show in the photograph. This is the Lesdiobolus cuniculi, the white one, and then the orange one, Kynimania stercoraria. Spectacular under a microscope. One of the neatest things to look at under a microscope. But I can't believe I was able to get this shot and find 5 species on 1 elk pellet. Another neat little ascomycete is this Bisonectria cartilaginea. You'll find this high in the Sierras, where the pica or pica, depending on how you pronounce it, this rodent-like rabbit comes out and uses the same latrine all winter long. So if you pick this thing up, it forms what's called a subiculum. That's this pale yellow-orange stuff, and then the bright orange fruiting bodies. And you can pick it up. It'll be as much as a foot long. You turn it over and you can see all the rodent droppings on the underside. If you find what you think is Bisonectria cartilaginea at lower altitude, and you turn it over and there's no rodent droppings, it's Bisonectria terrestris, which is formed by different rodents, but it's formed by their urine rather than a place where the animal has been defecating. So a lot of my interest in mushrooms is just in their beauty and their interesting reproductive structures. Now, and among the agaricus, among the gilled mushrooms, Lactarius and Russell aren't actually related at all to all the other agaricus, all the other agarics, all the other gilled mushrooms. They're a very unique subgroup. They break like a piece of chalk. Now, the Lactarius species tend to yield milk, but sometimes not very much, like Rubrulactis and the Deliciosus group. But other times they yield a lot of milk. This little tiny Lactarius grows all around my driveway and my walkways. And yet I took a close look at it last year, finally, for the first time after looking at it for 15 years and ignoring it because it's so small, and realized it's a totally unnamed species. So I've now got this thing out waiting for DNA. And then I'm trying to tell how this Lactarius differs from that Lactarius. So both of these are out for DNA. I know they were both once called Lactarius deliciosus, but I also now know that we've got about 5 different species, and we do not have the Lactarius deliciosus of Europe. And Russulas, which are closely related, we were talking earlier about the lobsters before this talk began. When members of the Russula brevipies complex, and there's quite a few species in the complex, get attacked by Hypomyces lactiflorum, gills never form, basidius spores never form. The mushroom is completely commandeered by the ascomycete, and it grows throughout the fungus, not just on the surface, and it's probably has infected the mushroom before it even emerges from the ground. So this is the mushroom, the brevipies complex, that's going to turn into the lobster mushroom. Now, sometimes some of these brevipies complex mushrooms aren't as good eating as others, and you might get a little bit of a stomach upset from it. And then some of these russulas are really, really hot when you bite them. Russula emetica has a very, very white spore print. It has a very, very fragile stem, and it is always reliably colored. And this is one of the things you can rely on with russulas. It's always bright red, pure white, pink, orange, or any combination of those colors. And that's characteristic of russula. Also something like Russula xerompolina. I once had a bet against the 4A mycologist from Montana, a great friend of mine, Kathy Cripps. Somebody brought in just a lemon yellow russula. And I said, oh, that's Russula xerompolina, because it bruised brown on the base, and the stem is thicker and meatier than the stem of something like Russula emetica, but it didn't have any smell, because xerompolina complex smells like shrimp or like crab. But you've got to get them in the house or have them old before you can smell that smell. But that brown bruising is characteristic. And it can be bright yellow when it first emerges, and then it changes color in the sunlight. And so I won a case of beer off of Kathy, because she would not believe that it was a xerompolina until the world's russula expert arrived at the fora and says, oh yeah, that's just xerompolina, a young one. So these things can be almost black. They can be velvety, they can be smooth, but they're typically a combination of purple, tan, green, and one of the most delicious russulas. And you can eat any mild flavored russula. In fact, you could probably even get away with eating Russula emetica, but it's peppery as all heck. And so if you're going to identify a russula, by the way, there's several things you do. Look at the stem. If it's really, really fragile, well, I'm not interested in it from an eating standpoint. If it's really, really hard and firm, the compacte group, I might be interested, but usually not. If it's in between, then it's just right. That's the xerompolina complex, unless it's in the fragrantissima complex, which smells like a lovely combination of benzaldehyde or almonds and baby vomit. And we have several species in the complex. None of them are correctly named. The other thing you do in identifying a russula, in addition to tasting it to see if it's peppery or not, you peel the cap cuticle. And on these, the cap cuticle largely peels right off. On the xerompolina complex, the cap doesn't peel much at all. And on my last mushroom hunt on Saturday, I was out with a group of people. We'd been 5 minutes into the woods. I found this mushroom that smelled like cedar. It wasn't shaped properly like a russula. It was a beautiful cone-shaped thing. Russulas are usually flatter, pure white, and pure white gills. And I realized immediately I had a russula. It had a stem much like the xerompolina, nice meaty stem. So I took a bite out of the stem first, because the stem is always milder than the cap. And it was just fiery hot, clearly a totally unnamed species. And but we're coming to the end now. One of my favorite groups of edibles are the bear's head, which are the top two mushrooms, Hericium abeatus, which grows on conifers, and Hericium arenaceus, the lion's mane, which grows on hardwoods. Now, the lion's mane, I've seen up to 10 or 12 pounds in a single specimen. You just slice it like you were slicing slices of ham to fry for breakfast in the morning. You fry it at a medium-high heat till it's nicely browned on both sides. It has a beautiful, just an incredible lobster flavor. The commercially grown arenaceus has a really nice texture, but it doesn't have that wonderful lobster flavor of the wild ones. At least so far, I haven't encountered. Hericium coralloides is fairly rare, and I don't mess around with eating it. It's not meaty enough, but both Hericium arenaceus, all of the Hericiums are good at neuroregeneration. And so I try and eat some lion's mane literally every day to preserve some of my remaining brain cells. It's potentially useful when used in combination with microdosing psilocybin, lion's mane, and niacin, vitamin B3. It's been shown to, in studies in Asia, to appear to slow the progression of Alzheimer's and slow the projection of all neurological diseases like Lou Gehrig's disease, any tremors in the hands, because it regenerates neurons. And lion's mane by itself will do it, but if you combine it with microdosing psilocybin, we're talking about 0.2 of a gram, a tiny, tiny amount, won't get you high. Some niacin, which might get you feeling very flushed and make your heart race. And then lion's mane, you've got a good chance of living longer and being healthier. And that wraps up the program. These are king boletes. So if you want to learn more about my book, the website is mushroomsofcascadia.com. That's where you get ordering information. And a free online program that I recommend to everyone is MycoMatch. So what I don't have in my book is complete descriptions of the mushrooms. I focus on how you tell one mushroom from another. Because when you see in a typical field guide, two descriptions side by side, I often read line by line by line, and I'm trying to figure out how they're telling the two mushrooms apart. So my book is entirely about how you tell mushrooms apart, and it's designed to be used with MycoMatch, which covers 4,000 species found on the West Coast, primarily in the Pacific Northwest, and has about 8,000 photographs. It's all free. I'm a co-author, and that ends the program.
Thank you, Michael.
I probably overran
fantastic.
time-wise. I get long-winded.
No, not at all. So we have a question and answer session.
Yep, ready.
Do we have any questions? I'll start if no one else does, because actually I'd like to focus on your book for a second. Was that website you just flashed, is that where you think we should buy the book?
Yes, unless you want to buy it for the whole club, buy 10 copies at a time. If you're just buying a single copy, you go to Fungi Perfecti. Paul Stamets paid all the cost of producing this book. And so I gave him his company exclusive distribution rights, except for the copies that I sell. And so you'd be buying direct from Paul's company. And he bought 1,250 copies from me that paid back the loan that financed the book.
Well,
and
that's
he's
excellent.
selling it through his website.
Thank you. It's just Fungi Perfecti, we'll find it.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Or if you go to my website, mushroomsofcascadia.com, there'll be a window where you can just click on the window and it'll take you to their website.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That's great. So I can hardly wait to get a copy. I don't get up there enough.
Well, the thing is, I believe this book will, even if it's got a lot of species you don't find in California, it'll tell you how to recognize a Cortinarius and how to tell it from an Anosmia, how to tell it from a Pinealis, a Psilocybe. And with over 900 species, the coverage is massive. You know, and a lot of the things that I have in the book, we are a refugia of California species in the Columbia Gorge. And so
Yeah,
I've got a lot of
I
California
don't
mushrooms.
think everyone necessarily knows what a refugia is.
So in the Ice Age, there was an area in the Columbia Gorge that stayed with the same kind of trees and a lot of the same small mammals and herps and snakes that you find only in California. You don't find them anywhere else in Washington. You don't find them in Oregon or even in Northern California. They're Central and Southern California species. And so we've got some habitats that look very much like California when you walk in them. And when we look at the mushrooms, a lot of the mushrooms are the same. The neat thing about the Columbia Gorge is I've got habitats within 40 minutes of my house of everything you would find from Southern Alaska to Central California, except for the redwood forest. So I've got low elevation marine, and within 20 minutes from my house, I can be hiking up to snow level on Mount Adams, or 30 minutes from my house, I can be hiking up to snow level. I can be driving right above tree line on Mount Hood, or I can go east and I'll be in semi-desert. I can go west, then I'll be in a marine ecosystem in rainforest. They're all here. And so all those things are in the book.
Other questions from people?
Yeah, I was curious why you didn't point out the smell as being the distinguishing characteristic of the Matsutake versus the, what is it, the Smithy? What is the Amanita?
Because a lot of people can't tell the difference. I think that Smithiana smells like chlorine, and the Matsutake smells like the dirty gym socks and red hots. But also in cold weather, you often don't smell much. You've got to warm the mushroom up before you can smell it. So if you're in the field and you want to be sure what you have, the things I said are positive. But I have also found Matsutakes that smell pretty indistinguishable from the Smithianas. So that's why I didn't use smell. And a lot of people make the mistake. They think, well, it smells like a Matsutake, so it must be. You need more than just smells. But I use smell, I use taste, I use texture, I feel mushrooms. I pull them apart when I'm trying to identify them, because how different species tear apart differs markedly. And often, like chanterelles pull apart sort of like a chicken breast.
Exactly.
Very reminiscent. But a Matsutake wouldn't pull apart like that.
Yeah, no, it's just the first time I found a Matsutake, I didn't know I had a Matsutake, but that smell was just like, I'm just like, what is that? So for me, that's just, when I find a Matsutake, that's the smell is what tells me that I have a Matsutake. So
yeah, I've walked with students who can smell them from 50 feet. I have to be right on top of them, put them against my nose before I can smell them.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I guess my sense of smell is pretty good. So.
Yeah, and I'm a chemist, and I ruin my sense of smell. One of my favorite Matsutake, I was at a big foray at Priest Lake, Idaho, and on the last day of the foray, everyone's packing up to leave. And with Judy Roger, and my college's friend that had driven to the foray with me, we just went around the cabins and along the beach, right at the resort, where 70 people had been foraying for 4 days, and we filled my 80-quart ice chest completely full of Matsutake, right nice. Under the nose of all these people. They were all leaving. They didn't see what we were doing. We just quietly, completely filled the ice chest.
All right.
And we did not leave the grounds where everyone was foraying.
Nice one. Thank you.
I have a separate question. Today when I was at school, I found a lot of false earth stars. And there's a lot of like unopened ones kind of growing embedded in the soil, but right above some of the unopened ones, I found this Earth star, which looked clearly different from the other false Earth stars. So I was wondering,
Can you hold that up one more time? Okay, well, that, you see the way that there's sort of a double layer inside the way it broke up when it matured?
yeah, so
So
that
if you had my book, you could quickly put a name on the mushroom you're holding, because
yeah,
it's in there.
yeah, so I think this is a collared Earth star, but
It's a collared Earth star. That's exactly right.
yeah, but I've never found like two species of Earth stars growing so closely together.
Yeah, it happens.
Yeah, because there was also the Astreus, the false Earth stars.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
I do note there's a question in the chat from Pete Block. It says, as a chemist, do you often use mass spec to document some VOCs related to some of the new species you found during their fruiting? So VOCs would be volatile organic carbon compounds, I think.
Right, that's exactly right. And the answer is no, because I've been retired for 20 years now, and I haven't actually used a mass spectrometer. I think the last time I used a mass spectrometer would have been about 1980. And I know they're doing a lot of that work right now up at the University of Edmonton, in University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. And people do that work, but that hasn't been the kind. I was more looking at the natural product chemistry using liquid chromatography and that sort of technique. But I have used mass specs a lot, just not for that purpose. And I see a question about books I'd recommend for chemical analysis for mushrooms. I don't know that there are any. Not that I'm
There's
aware of.
really, when I take classes out and we smell like, the Clorox smell that you get with some of the antilomas, for example. I remind students that no one travels around with a mass spec, and mushrooms don't come up every day.
Yeah, and that smell that you're smelling could be as many as 300 different compounds mixed together in varying proportions. And as the proportions vary, the exact smell varies. So it's a very complicated subject. And that's one of the, I knew how complicated it was, and I said, I don't want to work that hard. And so I've never done it. My interest has always been elsewhere.
Other questions? One thing you mentioned was Sarcomyxa, if I heard you correctly, extinct in the wild?
What about?
Did you say Sarcomyxa was extinct in the wild? Did I hear that
the
wrong?
Sarcomyxa that I haven't named yet appears to be extinct in the wild. I found it on 2 adjacent oak stumps. It fruited on those stumps for about 7 or 8 years, and it's not there anymore. And I have looked on oaks for probably 12 years since I first saw that thing to find another one. I've never found another one anywhere. Nobody else has ever, nothing like it has ever shown up on iNaturalist or Mushroom Observer. Noah Siegel, and I've talked to Noah about it. I've talked to Christian Schwartz about it. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. So I'm pretty sure it still exists in the American Culture Collection. So Paul filed that collection with the Federal Registry, but I don't find it anymore in the wild. And that's the other reason I'm not going to name it. I needed to find more before I went ahead and tried to name it. And don't want to name something from one collection.
Okay. I see another one in the chat that asks, you were describing some mushrooms as hot. Did you mean hot and spicy or hot and temperature wise?
I meant burn your tongue and even blister it, but spicy hot, a habanero pepper hot.
So you also mentioned warm, and I think you were talking about thermogenesis too.
Oh
with
yeah,
with that pinellus,
yeah. Then
and maybe even the Boletus edulis.
well, Boletus edulis was, yeah, it was just actively metabolizing and producing enough heat, thermogenesis, to keep from freezing, even though the temperature outside was cold enough to freeze all the waterfalls in the gorge.
So I guess he was talking about both, depending on which one.
Yeah, that's a different kind of something totally different. Yeah.
Of the mushrooms that are spicy, are there those among them that are like reliably edible and tasty that could be mixed into various culinary uses?
Until Paul Stamets came to visit me a couple of weeks ago, I would say I didn't know of any. Now, the thing about the hot rushless, I don't eat mushrooms raw. I always cook them thoroughly. And when you cook a rushlet, the heat goes away. The heat's only there in the raw mushroom. But Paul has dried a number of different hot rushlets, powdered them, and used them as a spice without getting sick. But I also get a lot of poisoning reports from people who eat hot rushlets cooked lightly or even cooked well cooked, and do get quite sick with gastrointestinal distress. So the answer is complicated. Some of them you can eat and some of them you can't. And we don't really know which ones you can eat. Now, if you were in Finland, they eat virtually all rushlets, but there are some that they consider poisonous. I've gone hunting a fair amount with a couple of Finnish Cortinarius experts, and we've talked about what rushlets and lactarius they eat. They eat a lot of things that we don't eat, but there's definitely some of the hot ones that they consider poisonous. But you have to know which ones. And I don't. I just avoid all the hot ones.
Gotcha. I'm not going to roll those dice then.
Yeah, in reality, I almost exclusively eat king boletes, lion's mane, chanterelles, and morels. That's about it.
Looks like there was another question in chat about the quantity of spicy mushrooms.
What do you mean?
Number
How
of
much you would
species?
eat of a spicy mushroom?
No, like it was someone named Victoria who was asking whether a lot of mushrooms are spicy or whether that was a more rare trait.
Oh, how common. I would say there's a lot of different flavors and only a small percentage are hot. Now, a large percentage if it's the genus Lactarius, and a large percentage if it's a genus Rushla, a small percentage if it's any other genus. But there are hot ones that aren't either Rushla or Lactarius.
Do you know much about the tradition in Eastern European countries of pickling Russellas? I know sometimes it's like, I think it's like cold pickling and hot pickling. I was trying to research this a while ago.
Yeah, I've got a section about pickling in my book. You've got to be careful doing it because if you don't pickle it just right, you can get some nasty spoilage organisms. So pickling is tricky, and it's not really recommended, but it is a very common practice in Eastern Europe, and it is said to detoxify most of the hot Russellas and Lactarius, for example. But I don't know which species you want to make sure you don't put in the pickle. And there are some that you don't put in the pickles.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions?
I was gonna quick ask about the alder cone fungus that you showed. That I thought that was really interesting. How often do you come across that that sac-like fungi?
I have searched and searched and searched for it. I have one spot about 25 miles from my house where there's always a lot of it. And I've never found it except in that one place. And when we looked for it in Newfoundland, when I was with Tom Volk, we didn't find any. But they're around. Yeah, and we have probably 3 or 4 different species of Taphrina that will infect alder cones. And so which species you have varies, but they all look the same. You really have to have DNA or spores to sort of tell which one you're looking at.
Oh, so they all form that sac.
They all form the tongues.
I see.
And I just find it interesting.
Oh, yeah.
And then I think in the back, the back cover of my book where I'm wearing the mushroom hat, the Amadou hat, I'm looking at peach leaf curl, which is Taphrina deformans, a different species, but the same genus. And that can actually kill the tree. It'll cause the leaves, enough leaves to fall off that the tree will die. It doesn't kill the alder, it just affects the cones.
Wow, thank you.
I had 2 more questions actually that have come to mind if we have time for them.
Go ahead.
You mentioned that one of the main mushrooms that you eat is the king boletes, and that those are generally centered around oak trees. Right?
No. The king boletes themselves, Boletus edulis, we've got Boletus edulis variety Grand edulis, which you find on the coast of California, Washington, Oregon, clear up into Alaska, seems to be in a mixed hardwood conifer forest. And then Boletus edulis variety edulis, which is also on the coast and also in the mountains, is only associated with spruce.
Okay.
And then if you go inland, so you're in Colorado, and Four Corners region, you get up high, then you have a red-capped edulis thing, a Boletus rubriceps, called rubies. Really gorgeous, really delicious. I once found a ruby. I was leading a group of 12 people in the Tetons, and it was a button, just a baby, and we couldn't get 2 hands all the way around the stem. We fed 12 people off of one mushroom, and there was a mature one next to it, and it was 3 feet in diameter.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And the folks that went to the Namaphore in Colorado this summer picked rubies by the carloads. It can just be stupendously abundant. And it
fantastic.
Is delicious.
Then probably, since you're farther up north, this might be a question that's more appropriately addressed to some of the other members of the Los Angeles Society. I was wondering if anyone knew if there were any sort of good areas around Southern California, either coastal or more inland, where Boletus could be found.
Well, I wish Steve Pencall were here. He's the former LAMS field trip chair. And I believe that it's rare that it occurs, but when you get a late August rain in the San Bernardino Mountains, you can get, I think it's Boletus barosii.
I would expect barosii in that habitat.
Yeah, and there was a year, but it hasn't been for like, I want to say 8 years that they had the late rains, the August rains. So that's one of them. There probably are a few other places that people aren't like publicly acknowledging. I mean, LAMS was telling people this is the place to go. I've seen some photographs at LAMS over the years that suggest there's some other places, but there's nowhere I could send you that I know of personally, and I have not found it to tell you where to go. And I think that what Michael was just saying about Colorado, et cetera, It's really spectacular when you go to a place outside of SoCal and you do see what you can find in terms of mushrooms. I don't know if you're a regular LAMS member, but stay tuned and talk to other people in LAMS. Not everyone gives away their spots, but they do give away generalizations. And the generalization I gave you was, that's the hottest one I can give you. You just might have to wait another 8 years. Not sure.
Yeah.
Or
No,
go
this is-
north, or go west, or go northwest. Or
Yeah, but
northeast,
how
rather.
far
Sorry.
north do you have to go? Santa Cruz is far north as you need to go. And sometimes they'll grow well south of Santa Cruz in a good season.
Yeah,
I made that
think-
drive today, actually.
There you go. I mean, I think that's the right way of putting it.
Gotcha. And to answer your slight question earlier, this is actually my first meeting, and I'm greatly enjoying all of the knowledge that everyone is willing to share.
Great. Well, welcome to LAMS. Glad
Thank
to
you.
have you.
So let me surrender some intelligence. 2012 and 2015 were amazing years for white porcini in the San Bernardinos. There was a lot.
I think that's what I'm talking about, Andre, and I
Excellent.
was not in on that.
Yeah.
But go ahead and tell them what you know. It was announced by LAMS.
Yeah, exactly. The 2015 one at least. But then I also found the Barossia in Tapia Park already. So, but that was
Really?
when we had good rains.
Okay.
So
I would think the area like around Arrowhead would be a good place to look.
yeah, it was actually further back the back way up to Big Bear off the 38. I think
Yeah,
that was
I've
a good
hunted
area.
Big Bear a
Yeah.
bit.
I think they have more ponderosa over there than up
Okay.
in Arrowhead. I think Arrowhead has different trees. They're usually more Jeffreys and Coulter pines, but there's a lot of ponderosas up the back way. What is that area called again, where they go for morels also? I forget, but
Well,
yeah,
I know Steve takes them to Strawberry Peak.
yeah, but there's another spot.
There's another spot.
Yeah, the back way up to 38.
Barton Flats.
Yeah, exactly. That's the one.
Okay.
Barton
Yeah,
Flats.
that sounds right.
Yeah, but as I said, Tapia, I found it before there. It was in wet winters, so that was only one time that I found it there. But,
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Andre. I appreciate you
yeah,
sharing.
you're welcome. Yeah, just the thing is, when there's a lot of rain, hike as many miles as you can.
Yeah.
I agree
You're not
with-
going to have to tell me twice.
All right. Good.
I agree with Andre there. Even like anywhere on the west side and all the canyons, when there's moisture, there's mushrooms all over the place. I haven't found any like king boletes in LA, but I go to the Sierra a lot in the summers, and I reliably find many pounds while backpacking. Like everywhere I've gone hiking in the Sierra, pretty much every trail. Just have to be there kind of
Fantastic.
at the right time.
I don't need another excuse to go to the Sierras, but I will happily take one.
Yeah, it's useful to know just what a king bolete looks like, and that'll take you pretty far.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone.
Perfect. Good. I'm glad that's helpful. Well, perhaps we should end here. I'd really like to ask for another round of applause for Mike. I mean, I think it's super fantastic, and I really appreciate your book, and which I don't have yet, that I'm going to have. And I appreciate your introduction to it, and I can see that all the other LAMS members do as well.
I'll actually have one more question, Michael. Do you accept visitors?
I have a pretty regular stream of visitors. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I haven't been to the gorge in a long time, and if you're ever up for it, I'd love to visit and go for a hike.
Yep. Yeah, I'm going out tomorrow with somebody on a hike who wanted to check out a spot. And I got somebody else planning to come up soon.
Yeah, it won't be very soon, but maybe next year.
Yeah.
Question.
Well, this is a horrible season, the worst I've seen in 50 years. Too dry.
Uh-oh.
It's terrible.
Question.
Oh.
Can we get a copy of this program?
So we're being recorded, and the LAMS has been posting these Zooms on their archive. The chat is posted separately, and you can actually also access the chat.
Thank you.
Uh,
We hope Mike agreed to that.
Yeah, well,
If
we
not,
didn't
tell
talk
it.
about it, but yeah.
We'll delete it if that's a problem.
I've actually signed forms with other clubs, but yeah, I share my stuff freely.
Yeah, okay, great. I don't want to cut us off prematurely, but I'd also like to let our speaker go and really super appreciate this evening.
Okay.
Thanks again, Mike. I really appreciate it. You know, the great talk and great series of talks by you over the years. And so, you know, super. And actually, just wanted to, you know, actually, I don't want to shut up. I really appreciate the fact you made some inroads with Cortinarius. So many speakers have mentioned lack of inroads with Cortinarius and lack of identification or description of new species. I'll just cut it off there, but that's the added bonus of what you presented tonight. If you go back in time over LAMS, that's one of the things that's been commented on a number of times.
Okay.
So thanks again. There's a real thumbs up.
Good night, all.
Thanks again. Take care.